Good afternoon. My name is Shelley Levine, and I practice law in the areas of immigration, refugee, and family law. Levine Associates has been in business since 1990, so we're in our 26th year. The refugee hearings that we attend before are before a federal tribunal called the Refugee Protection Division of the Immigration and Refugee Board, so that's a lot to take in, but it's a federal tribunal. It's the biggest tribunal throughout Canada. And we have a tribunal located just down the street, so we're only about a 2-minute walk from the IRB that's hearing our cases for the refugee files. So refugee lawyers in Canada represent, for the most part, people who make refugee claims either at a port of entry, such as the air, so they arrive by air and they advise an immigration officer at the airport that they wish to make a refugee claim. Or alternatively, people arrive by land, and sometimes more complicated process if they come in through the United States, which would be the only land border. Then we have a statute that can require the person actually to go back and have their claim heard in the United States. But there are certain exemptions that allow a person to come into Canada having made their claim at the land border from the United States. When people make those claims, they're called refugee claimants, and they're entitled to have a hearing before the Immigration and Refugee Board. And that's where I come in. We would then attend at the tribunal with the claimant, and it would be our job to establish their claim based on the convention definition. And the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act defines what a convention refugee is. It would basically be a person who fears persecution in their home country as a result of things like their political opinion or their religion, their membership in a particular social group, and so on. So there's a very set definition of what a convention refugee is. And for example, a person that has fled, Bangladesh is a country that often suffers from flooding. A natural disaster, almost annual natural disaster that occurs in that country, that's not the kind of refugee that the convention protects. The convention protects people against man-made problems. So like I say, somebody's being persecuted because of their religion, or they're being persecuted because of their political opinion. If it's a natural disaster, we wouldn't actually succeed in establishing their claim unless there's some evidence that that disaster has been caused because of the person's political opinion or their religion and so forth. So the people hear the term convention refugee, and the term convention has a very specific meaning, and it derives from the United Nations, who set up a convention to deal with refugees after the Second World War. And initially, that convention was intended to deal specifically with refugees that were produced as a result of the Second World War. The most obvious would be the survivors of the Holocaust, as well as other displaced people as a result of things like political opinion or other, or nationality, ethnicity, religion, etc., those sorts of people. But it was very time sensitive. It dealt specifically with people that were refugees produced by the Second World War. The United Nations then came forward in 1967 agreeing amongst the member states that this old definition was no longer sufficient because the world continued to produce new refugees who were not covered by that earlier convention. So they created a protocol to basically say that the way they defined refugees remains, but there's no longer going to be a timeline. So the original definition or the original convention would no longer be limited to people who were determined to be refugees as a result of the Second World War. It would now be extended forward to anybody at any time forward who's determined to be a convention refugee. And so it's that protocol that Canada adopted or ratified, and it's that protocol, that convention definition, that we now apply in our law presently when I appear before the Refugee Board. That's the law that I have to establish. So we've incorporated the actual wording from the United Nations Convention into our domestic immigration law. So Canada has recognized convention refugees and has set up a variety of ways that refugee claimants can make their claims. I've already talked about refugee claimants that can make their claims when they arrive at our port of entry, or they can actually make inland claims as well. Sometimes we've seen students that arrive here as legitimate students, and then something terrible happens back in their home country. Those people are also entitled to make refugee claims. The next way that refugees are accepted into the country is by Canada actually going overseas. Sometimes we literally go into a refugee camp and we choose individuals that we think would be suitable, and they are brought back into the country as convention refugees. They actually arrive at the border with a visa for permanent residency based on the determination that the officers have made, often adopting people that have already been determined to be convention refugees by the UNHCR. That process is quite different than the domestic process, because in those cases lawyers are often not involved. It's simply an immigration officer that's going abroad, interviewing a claimant, determining whether that person meets the definition, and then if so, they're given the appropriate paperwork to move forward to come into Canada. The other process that we're hearing a lot about in the news is sponsorships. So Canada has allowed different kinds of groups, sometimes what are referred to as G5s, groups of 5 individuals. Sometimes it can be a church group, variety of different kinds of groups that can come forward to sponsor refugees. And so this is similar to the kind of process that Canada has, where Canada actually goes into the camps. Here, people come forward to sponsor refugees, which means putting forward money and putting forward an agreement that they will basically care for the needs of the refugee for about a year. And when these kinds of sponsorships are done, they're called private because it's not directly through the government, but there's often programs that involve both the government and these private groups that work in tandem to bring refugees over to Canada, and we're seeing that in the case of the Syrian refugees.